Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Tinker Talk, a weekly podcast dedicated to generating thought-provoking discussion points in the world of football. I'm Josh Andrews, and I'm joined by Matthew David, who has given me the rights to do the intro this week because of my lovely voice. Hi, Matthew.
That was so much better than my intro last week. Hello.
Hello. Thank you. This week we will be discussing Cameroon winning the African Cup of Nations, new government legislation on the FA, and the controversies around the Borussia Dortmund versus Leipzig match on Saturday. So Matthew, Cameroon.
Yep, Cameroon won their 5th African Cup of Nations title on Monday against Egypt in Gabon and came from behind to win 2-1. Goals from Nkulu and Abubakar cutting out El Neni's opener. But despite their win, the conversation's been more about the players who weren't there than the ones who were.
Sure, a lot of talk has been around the absences of Joel Matip and Alan Niom in the Cameroon squad. Why weren't they involved, Matthew?
Well, Alan Niom's fairly clear cut. He originally didn't want to go when he was asked, and then he changed his mind, but by the time he did, he was told it was too late. Matip's a little bit more complicated, because when he was at Schalke, he originally retired from international football, citing past bad experiences with the technical staff.
Sure.
But because he never put it in writing, the Cameroon FA decided they'd call him up anyway.
Right.
I'm assuming more in optimism than anything else, because obviously they knew that he'd said he didn't want to play for them anymore.
Right.
But because of the fact he didn't put it in writing, and the fact they called him up, he wasn't actually able to play for Liverpool for a little while, because he didn't get international clearance. And it's kind of sparked a bit of a conversation about whether or not players should be made to play for their country, or do you think there should be sanctions if they choose not to?
I don't feel that would be totally fair. I mean, first of all, I don't think national pride is ingrained into everybody, so being forced to play for your national team, you know, if for whatever reason you don't feel a particular affinity with that country, there's just no, moral grounds to say, well, you should have to play for them. But even taking that aside, Matip, especially having resigned from international duty previously, and again, paperwork aside, I don't think it would be fair to sanction a player who's obviously made it known that he wishes to retire. What about your thoughts?
I think players should be encouraged to play for their national team. If nothing else, because of the kind of pride and stuff it can bring to the kind of population in those countries.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, obviously, if players don't want to play for their national team for whatever reason, it would be hard to think of a kind of a fair sanction or kind of, dissuasion, if you'd rather, from actually retiring from international football.
Sure. I mean, I guess an easy thing for people to sort of compare this to, I guess, is if a player like John Stones for England were to refuse to play for his national team, that wouldn't, I don't feel like that would sit well, particularly with English fans. I don't feel that English fans would particularly understand that. But does that necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with it or not? Maybe that could be down to the fact that sort of the international tournaments, that are competed in, when you consider, the Euros, the World Cup, although Cameroon are obviously involved in that as well, and more, international tournaments like that are more prestigious than the African Cup of Nations. But what would you think about that?
I think from kind of our perspective in England, and probably perspective in most of Europe, it would be that the African Cup of Nations perhaps isn't, the biggest of international tournaments.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's... I think that's fairly kind of, nearsighted. Because if England won the Euros, for example, people in Brazil, for example, might think, well, that's no big deal. But here we'd probably feel quite differently. I think the problem is when you look at the kind of teams that compete in the Euros, the Copa America. Copa America, for example, you're talking teams like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, who they can compete on the world stage, whereas in the past, teams from that would compete in the African Cup of Nations perhaps haven't. I mean, the furthest a team's got, I think, was Ghana in 2010. I think they got to the semi-final.
That's at the World Cup.
Yeah, sorry. So I think here we maybe view it as not being as important, and it maybe makes the players not wanting to play there a bit more understandable to us.
Sure.
But yeah, it's a difficult situation.
Oh.
Do you say how?
I did not say how. I merely said, huh.
Oh. Well, I'll answer how anyway and pretend you did say it.
Sure, go on then.
I think because, obviously, Matty didn't want to play before. He wouldn't have changed his mind just because African Cup of Nations came around.
Sure.
Neom, I think, will regret it a little bit because, well, he ended up wanting to play for them. So, I think you probably, maybe in hindsight, they'll feel like maybe it would have been a good experience to go and have that for their country. But prior, thinking maybe, you know what, it's only the African Cup of Nations, might be the thought. Maybe, there's all likelihood they wouldn't win. I mean, even in the final, Egypt were by far the favourites.
Moving on. This week there have been discussions on reforms of the FA, and the government are expecting to vote on a motion of no confidence of the way the FA is currently run. Matthew?
Yeah, there's huge question marks over the way that the money that they have is kind of distributed around for football in the country. Considering the FA are kind of in charge at every level when it comes to football, being the Football Association.
Sure.
It does seem that a majority of their money isn't spent in a way that, well, certainly based on their kind of no confidence vote, or potential
Sure.
no confidence vote, I should say, the government aren't particularly happy with. And even some of the previous chairmen have kind of said that they don't think that the FA is capable of reforming on its own. What are the government suggesting?
Well, Damien Collins, who is the chairman of the DCMS Select Committee, he claims that the only way of reform of the FA can be achieved will be through legislation, and in that vein, there has been a draft of some legislation drawn up with two major proposals. The first of which is that the FA board must have a majority of completely independent members, not members from the Premier League or from the Football League, completely independent. And the second change would see the FA Council, who are a separate part of the organisation, lose their ability to veto changes agreed by the board. And failure to get in line with those new governance guidances by April would likely see the FA lose £30 million in public funding.
Yeah, I think at the moment, I know you said about the board of the FA, I think is it 9 out of the 12 current board members are representatives of Premier League and Football League clubs.
That's correct.
That's kind of ridiculous if you think about it. So, what the government suggests does sound, it sounds fairly sensible.
Sure. We're talking about how the FA is, currently distributing their money as well. I mean, a third of the money that they invest into football is going into the FA Cup, am I right?
It is around that. I think they invest about 116.7 million. Their last financial reports, I think that was the total. Sure. And about 34 million of their investment was just for the FA Cup. Which, maybe that doesn't sound too ridiculous, but for coaching, as well as county FAs, their financial input was 29 million. So that's 5 million less on that than just on their one showpiece tournament, which kind of, I think, shows a little bit how they have slight problems with distributing and how it kind of only, it doesn't get where it's needed as much, perhaps, the funding. I think that's what the government are fairly, I think, disappointed with.
That would make sense. I mean, it would be sort of easy, based on those particular, statistics, to explain some of the problems maybe going in the world of football right now. I mean, there are, all this money being invested into a tournament, but not necessarily a lot of money going into, new coaches in England. It would explain why there are so many foreign coaches and foreign players already being brought into England to try and boost the quality of it. If the quality isn't coming from the grassroots, then where is it going to come from?
I don't think that's unfair, and it's not something that's kind of been uncommon. There's been, throughout football history, there's a pattern of, importing from abroad to improve what you have at home. A good example would be Johan Cruyff at Barcelona.
Sure.
Quality of football in, obviously, the Netherlands was greater than in Spain at the time. It's not the case anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think obviously we've done that here. Look at the managers in the top division here now. There's obviously I don't think anyone would argue there's far better managers in the Premier League now than there's ever been before. So yeah, I think that's where the FA needs to be looking at trying to get us to. But if the money's not being spent right, which former chairman of the FA don't seem to believe, the government don't seem to believe, I think generally people in the country maybe wouldn't believe based on the progress we've really kind of made over the last God knows how many years, to be honest. I don't think we really progressed in terms of the quality of our coaches and our teams in a long time.
That's a fair statement.
I mean, it's quite difficult. I'm sure the government will continue to fund the FA. I don't think it will come to them withdrawing their funding.
I wouldn't expect so, especially with the just general football in this country being such a big thing for everyone involved. It just doesn't make sense for the government to completely stop funding it.
No, I completely agree. Speaking about the kind of development of players in England, big name retired in the last week, Frank Lampard. Your thoughts?
One of the best ever to grace the English game. You don't score the most goals from midfield in the Premier League and not be considered an all-time great as a result of that. He's clearly one of the best midfielders in the Premier League. There'll always be comparisons between him and the likes of Steven Gerrard and Paul Scholes, and they were obviously the three biggest midfielders of their generation, and I think Frank Lampard can definitely be considered in that realm of class of players. I think that speaks for itself, basically. Yourself?
In the past, I've kind of been a bit critical of Frank Lampard, which I don't know if it's so much that he's maybe not exactly the type of player that I'd like to have at my club kind of thing in terms of watching. But in terms of just sheer contribution, there's no denying that he's one of the greatest players of the Premier League era. Like you say, there's lots of kind of comparisons with Paul Scholes and Steven Gerrard. They're all very different players, all obviously very, very good. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Frank Lampard's kind of been a sort of massive part in turnaround at Chelsea over the years. Him and John Terry. So yeah, there's no kind of underestimating his influence on them.
In your opinion, is he the best player Chelsea have ever had?
Ooh.
Careful there.
Are we talking in terms of ability or in terms of influence while at the club?
State your opinion for both. Why not?
In terms of ability, no. Certainly not in my opinion.
That might upset a few people, but okay.
Sorry. But no, I don't think in terms of ability he is the best player they've ever had. I can think of a few more. Although you would have to go into slightly different positions. Granted, I think Hazard's technically better. He's there now. I think that Zola is obviously another one.
Sure.
In terms of the influence and where he'll stand in the kind of history of the club, I think you'd honestly there's the big three there for Chelsea, and I know there's kind of past glories from yesteryear. But I think John Terry, Frank Lampard, Didier Drogba are probably going to be, when you look back in maybe 30, 40 years, they'll still be talked about, I think.
Yeah, the spine of the greatest Chelsea team there's ever been.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, he's a great player, and see what he does next. Maybe we'll go into coaching.
Yeah. Frank Lampard isn't the only player to announce their retirement this week. Philip Lahm.
Fairly surprising. He's only 34, I believe. So he's retiring a bit earlier than most people
Sure.
normally do, but undoubtedly one of the greatest players of the modern era.
I agree.
In my opinion, probably the best right back in the history of the game. I think perhaps you disagree.
I mean, we're being nitpicky when we're saying I disagree. I think Cafu is probably going to be remembered as a more important, more revolutionary, and therefore sort of better right back. But in terms, I mean, certainly of his generation, the best right back there ever was.
Yeah, completely agree. I think he's a phenomenal footballer. He's kind of hugely intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
I think
club man as well.
Yeah, it's rare. Even Frank Lampard we were talking about a minute ago was West Ham, Chelsea, Man City, New York, and he's only going to be associated with one of them, but
sure.
But yeah, it's not a common thing anymore to be a kind of one club man, and I think Philip Lahm, I don't think he would ever really have thought about leaving Germany, not properly, not leaving Bayern. But I mean, when you talk about their kind of standing, the two of them, to kind of put them together,
sure.
You're talking about two people who between them have won 29 titles, 29 major titles as well.
That's that's no small feat. Yeah. Philip Lahm obviously having won, I believe, 7 domestic league titles.
Yeah, I think he's won seven league titles, 6 cups, 1 Champions League. Really should have won more than that, but yeah, just a one triumph, a couple of near misses, and obviously the World Cup.
Sure.
Which Lampard never got close to.
That's yeah.
I suppose it kind of helps Lahm that he has had such a high quality of kind of players with him at the time.
Sure, players that all knew how to work together as well.
Yeah, definitely. But phenomenal accomplishments over both of their careers, and Lampard's not going to play again. Lahm won't again after the end of the season.
Do you think Lahm would make a good coach?
Without a doubt, I think. Pep Guardiola, who's kind of renowned as being one of the top coaches in the world.
Sure.
Has kind of said that he's never worked with someone who's got more footballing intelligence. And I mean, him saying that, I think, is kind of backing enough to suggest that, yeah, he would be a phenomenal coach. But I don't think he wants to be. I think he said in the past that it looks like it would be too much work and too much stress for him. Which is a shame.
I guess that's perspective you might get when you working under Pep Guardiola.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, two very good careers, and both will be remembered fondly as 2 greats of the game.
Yep. On the topic of German football,
right?
There's a big game at the weekend, which I know we both wanted to talk about.
Yep.
Being Dortmund versus Leipzig.
Indeed.
Do you want to get into why?
Well, just as a quick comment on the actual game itself first. Dortmund won 1-0, and the Dortmund manager Tuchel, has claimed that it was a 4-0 disguised as a 1-0, in the sense where he believes that Dortmund should have won 4-0. Players like Royce missing a number of opportunities that could have put them further ahead. But that's not the biggest talking point of this game, as prior to the match, I believe, there was quite a lot of violence from the Dortmund fans towards the Leipzig fans. Matthew.
Yeah, so, to give you kind of idea, Leipzig are probably the most hated club in Germany. I want to get a little bit into why, just give you a bit of a background.
Sure.
So in Germany, they have a rule called the 50+1 rule.
Mm-hmm.
That means that club members have to have a majority voting stake in the club and how it's run.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 2009, Red Bull bought a club called Mockenstadt, who were at the time in the 5th division in Germany, wanting to make them their fifth Red Bull team after Salzburg, New York, Brazil and Ghana.
Sure.
So they bought the rights, and the Deutsche Fußballbund, who are the DFB, which is the German equivalent of the FA, they wouldn't let them, because of their statutes, they wouldn't let them use the corporate name when naming the club. So when it's called, I think people generally refer to it as kind of Red Bull Leipzig, but the RB actually stands for Rasenballsport because they weren't allowed to have Red Bull.
Mm-hmm.
But back to what I was saying about the 50+1, the way that they've kind of gone about it so that Red Bull have the majority of control. At a club like Dortmund, for example, to become a voting member, it costs you €62 per year.
Sure.
At Leipzig, to become a non-voting member, it costs over €1,000 per year. They have 17 voting members, most of which are Red Bull staff. And
right.
There's pretty much no way to become a voting member at Leipzig. So, whilst they are technically following the rule, they're also exploiting a massive, massive loophole, and fans aren't happy with that.
And I mean, I think that's perfectly understandable. Statements have been made about Leipzig from the CEO of Dortmund, I believe, Hans-Joachim Watzke, dismissing them as being founded purely to sell cans of soda.
Yeah. I mean, they're definitely doing more than that.
Sure. Second in the Bundesliga.
Yeah, I don't think there'd be quite as much animosity from a club like Dortmund, who obviously have a great history. Leipzig are making theirs now, in fairness. They have come from the 5th division to the Bundesliga in 8 years.
Sure.
So obviously there's not much of a past there. But I think the animosity kind of comes... Put it this way, if Leipzig weren't being successful, there wouldn't be as much hatred around them, I don't think. I think if they were sitting 18th in the table right now, I don't think there'd be as much anger towards them as, the fact that they're the only ones really coming close to Bayern in their league at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you can compare it, not directly, obviously, because I don't know how much corporate and commercial the comparison is, but you can talk about teams like Chelsea and Man City when they initially started making huge investments in the English game, and obviously there was a lot of animosity from other teams because of that, and obviously certainly not to the extreme that we're talking about here. I mean, but you talk about when money like this is being brought into a game, and especially in Germany where football is very much the people's game still in that country, and when you have a team like Leipzig who just come up and purely because of in their eyes purely because of their money, they've bought themselves a league challenge, a title challenge against Bayern Munich. You can understand why people would be a little bit annoyed with that.
Yeah, I think people. Let's put it this way: if it was a club that wasn't, owned by Red Bull, hadn't come up that quickly, I don't think there'd be as much hate, because you look at their squad; it's full of young players, and they aren't players who've cost an arm and a leg either.
Sure.
I think their record signing, it was £12 million for Oliver Burke from Nottingham Forest.
Mm-hmm. So
that's not exactly them, splashing the cash and buying their way to the top. It's just, I think, Ralf Rangnick's their director of football, and he's obsessed with young players. I think kind of Red Bull's kind of model, at least in Europe, so with Salzburg and Leipzig, has been to get young players, improve them. If they need to sell them on, then sell them on. If they're going to help them challenge, then they'll help them challenge. And I think if that was any club but Leipzig, I think that would be a kind of aim that would be greatly encouraged.
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just the similar sort of footballing model to many of the other smaller teams around them that just happens to be with the great big Red Bull logo on it.
Yeah, and they're doing it quite a bit better as well.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, talking about the kind of scenes that you saw before the match, it's not really welcome at all. I mean, there's images of fans walking around covered in, blood and...
Sure. Police being armed with batons and pepper spray, and I think there were 28 different charges of, law breaking.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. What was it? What was it that was said? Was it the Dortmund released a statement?
I think, yeah. Whoever expresses their opinion through means of violence and insults, as opposed to arguments, can and will not be a part of the Borussia Dortmund family. That was a quote from the statement released by Borussia Dortmund not too long after the incident.
Yeah, I mean, even in that statement in itself is quite interesting, because instead of saying that, they condemn the violence and all this stuff, they are actually suggesting, what, it's fine, we don't like them, let's argue and debate and all that, that's okay. But, of course it is okay, to kind of have that discussion. I think it's probably healthy. But,
sure.
But yeah, I think, obviously, they had to release a statement, but I just find it interesting, the wording.
Sure. It's not as, distant. It doesn't distance them from the entire thing as much as it probably should.
Yeah, I think, yes, it's obviously, they're condemning the acts of violence against, the fans of Leipzig, but not so much the kind of ill feeling towards them.
Sure.
Which is probably understandable. Whether or not that feeling would still be there if they won 8 points. Is that 8 points behind them now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was 11 leading into the game. I don't think there'd be so much kind of anger. I think it would be more, gloating with chance rather than kind of the violence that was, displayed. Yeah. I mean, do you think something like that will happen here eventually in England with Red Bull?
I mean, it's not completely out of the question. It's happened in America. It's happened in Austria. It's happened in Germany. I guess the question would be where and who.
Well, you'd imagine they'd go for a kind of fairly big city, because that seems to be their pattern. But I mean, Leipzig being in east, I think I'm right in saying that, in east of Germany, not many big teams are in that region. None, in fact. So I think in that area of Germany, it's well welcome. They pack out their stadium every week.
Yeah.
In Austria, it's obviously in Salzburg. America, New York. So I think you'd kind of be looking at a big city that maybe hasn't got that sort of representation, that sort of quality in maybe their recent history hasn't really been challenging at all. Like a sleeping giant type of club would be the kind of one that I think they'd end up buying.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to talk about clubs in maybe bigger cities, but not necessarily cities that are overly saturated with good football. I mean, you wouldn't think it would be a club in London, just because there's too big of a market for big clubs already there.
There was to talk about West Ham originally, though. There was links with them to wanting to buy West Ham.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Obviously came to nothing, and I think the owners kind of, poo-pooed it a bit. Said that it wasn't actually a kind of genuine interest there.
Sure, just speculation.
Yeah. But so there have been kind of many stories of them looking to invest in England.
I mean, yeah, why wouldn't you? At the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. However, there is a problem with it, and it might actually be a big problem for them next season. It's a problem. I can't remember who it was had the problem, but it was the Hearts owner at the time owned a club. I can't remember what the other club he owned was, but there was a problem where they were both going to compete in the Europa League.
Okay.
And because of the kind of the ownership of both clubs, there was a problem with that, and that's a problem that Red Bull could face next season, because it looks like Leipzig are very likely to win qualify for the Champions League.
Sure.
If Salzburg are in it as well, then there's very likely to be some sort of problem for them there because of the fact that they both be competing in the same competition.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of to do with match fixing and things like that.
Yeah.
Not to say they would, but obviously it's best to kind of err on the side of caution.
Mm-hmm.
So that remains to be seen. But that would be the problem if they bought a club in England as well, because then you'd be talking, they've got a club in England, Germany, and Austria, all who, well, you would think in theory would eventually be striving to be in the Champions League.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it'd be a bit more of a headache for them than anything else, really.
Well, there you go. A history on Red Bull and the teams that they've bought in the past. Moving on to some of the games that have happened in the English Premier League this week. Leicester versus Man United. Man United won, I believe, 3-0.
Yep.
Was very convincing. And coming out after that match, it appears that Ranieri is now the favourite to be sacked first.
It's ridiculous, really. You think... How many months ago was it now? It was, 8 months ago? 9 months ago?
Yep.
They were lifting the Premier League title, and that was unprecedented. No one expected that.
Sure.
And Leicester? What? But, 9 months later, he's staring down a barrel, allegedly. It's ridiculous, and I think Leicester's board are in a bit of a difficult position by where, Ranieri, he's obviously going to go down as, absolute kind of legend for Leicester.
Sure.
But that could be despite him, being there for a year and 3 quarters, which is kind of a ridiculous discussion, really.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, the discussion about him being sacked isn't so much ridiculous because of the result. It is purely because of the fact that 8 months ago Leicester were, champions of England.
Yeah, I think the results, any other manager would probably be in the same situation. I just think it's more surprising because of what happened as recently as 8 months ago.
Sure, it's one hell of a fall from grace.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Leicester are 1 point off the relegation places.
Mm-hmm.
We were mocking Chelsea last season a bit for how badly they defended their title. They'll be laughing their heads off now.
Yeah,
Leicester have definitely beaten that record for worst title defence.
I don't think that will be unfair.
Yeah.
The board have come out this past week, giving Ranieri a vote of confidence.
Yeah, that usually ends well when boards do that.
Yeah, I can remember, I think it was Andre Villas-Boas back when he was at Chelsea. Not too long after he was given his vote of confidence, he was gone.
Yeah, that seems to be the way generally.
Yeah.
I think Brendan Rodgers got one for Liverpool just before they sacked him. I think Mourinho got one from Chelsea just before they sacked him.
Yeah.
So it's not something that I think Ranieri would... I suppose he would have wanted the backing, but whether or not he would have wanted it in that way is...
Yeah. A public vote of confidence
it's
traditionally is not a vote of confidence.
Yeah, it's usually leeway a little bit, and that's the best that generally comes from it.
Sure. Albeit if Leicester win their next games, next 5 games, I don't think there'll be so much of a problem at all.
No, but that would be a big shock, especially considering they haven't scored in their last 5 league games.
That is true.
Losing the last 4.
Sure.
So it's it's not positive times for Leicester.
No.
I mean, yeah, it would be such a shame if things went bad this season after the story of last season. It would just, not that it would kind of take away what they did last season. Nothing would do that, but it would just taint the memory a bit. People would look back on them not as these unlikely champions. It would be they won the league and then got relegated.
Sure, you'd be talking about the worst Premier League champions ever.
Yeah, I mean the last team to kind of be in the situation they're in was Leeds in the first season of the Premier League. The season before they'd won the league by 4 points against over United. Next season they were fighting relegation. I think they avoided it by a very small amount.
Sure.
So it looks like Leicester would do the same, but at the same time, with the way teams are playing at the bottom of the table at the moment, it's questionable whether or not they will escape.
Sure.
I mean, if they keep playing like they did against United, they definitely won't.
No, I mean that's fair to say. But speaking about United, after the game, Mourinho claimed that he thinks people now like his style of play.
I'm not exactly sure where that's come from. I don't know if he's looking at teams like Chelsea this season and thinking, oh, they're playing the same way that I like to play, because they're definitely not playing in the same kind of style that he has. I think what he means is that teams are more okay to set up very defensively and hit teams on the counter attack.
Sure.
Which isn't his style so much as his kind of method, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, you can talk about take Chelsea this season now in their game against Everton.
Yeah.
Where I think we both agree it's probably the best 90 minutes of football we've seen in a very long time. From one club, from one team anyway.
It was a good performance. Very good performance.
It was a very strong performance from Chelsea. And yeah, at no point could that game have ever really been considered dull or boring.
No.
Which is obviously a sort of descriptive word that's been used to describe Mourinho at almost every club he's been at. So I don't think it's completely accurate for Mourinho to be claiming that his style of play is being, more sort of enjoyed and accepted. Because good defensive football isn't always boring. You can win 5-0, have a very solid defensive performance, and be entertaining. But that wasn't always the case. It was quite often not the case when Mourinho was managing at the clubs that he's managed at. Albeit, in fairness, because I don't want to take away from this particular victory against Leicester, they did actually look very good that day.
Yeah, I think you're saying about teams can kind of be very good defensively and still be entertaining. I think it's more difficult when teams defend in the way that Mourinho's kind of gathered a reputation, really, for setting up his team defensively.
Sure.
You look at Conte, for example, at Chelsea. Mm-hmm. They defend from the front. They don't just have their banks at the back. I think Mourinho, he does try to get his teams to press a bit at least. But I think whereas Chelsea's defending and Man City's defending and other teams, kind of Tottenham as well, their defending's more on the front foot, whereas Mourinho's is kind of more on the back foot. He wants people tracking back, covering runs, that sort of stuff.
Sure.
And I don't think that any other teams really play his style of football, at least not in the Premier League. So I don't really understand what he's talking about. Other games in the Premier League, Everton, Bournemouth would have caught many people's eyes.
Sure, 6-3 was a very entertaining game.
Yeah, it was
very entertaining.
So good. Could have been more goals for both teams as well, which is slightly crazy.
Sure. I mean, you wouldn't imagine either of the managers being particularly pleased with
their defence, certainly.
That particular match.
Yeah, I think Koeman will be slightly happier than Eddie Howe.
Yeah, I don't think that's unfair. Especially when you have a player like Romelu Lukaku, who's, I mean, definitely player of the match for this particular game. How highly do you rate his performance?
He was unplayable. He grabbed 4 goals, took him to top of the scoring charts in the Premier League. He's on 16 now.
Mm-hmm.
He's 23, and he's at that age. He's got the 3rd highest goal tally of any player. It's either currently active in world football, or that would be it. So the only players who are currently playing who had more goals by his age are Messi and Neymar.
Which is bonkers.
Yeah, it's fairly prestigious company.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think either of us are going to start claiming that Lukaku is quite that good. But where would you say that he does rank right now in terms of Premier League strikers? Like, who is he as good as or better than? Is he the best?
He's not the best. It's not to say he's not a very good striker.
Sure. I mean,
that would be a really odd claim. But Aguero, I think. Well, Aguero is better than him. I think Kane is better than him. Ibrahimovic is probably better than him. There'd be an argument. It wouldn't. I don't know how valid it would be, but there would be an argument for Diego Costa.
Sure.
I think in terms of players that I could compare him to, he's like a fitter, much more clinical version of Giroud. Which probably doesn't sound like a great comparison to some people, but in terms of, he can finish from most angles, strong in the air, can probably pin anyone.
Sure. I mean, I don't think that's a entirely fair thing to say, because one of Lukaku's biggest strengths is that he's also able to run in behind. I mean, it's not like one of his necessarily biggest strengths, but he's certainly able to do that.
Yeah.
I'd trust him against one of the slower defenders in the Premier League.
That's fair.
Yeah. And when you have somebody who is as good on the ball as he is, I mean, granted he is no Aguero, but he's very good on the ball. He's a bulldozer when he wants to be. Personally, I think when you're talking about Lukaku now, I would put him as the second best striker in the Premier League. Just because I don't think there are any weaknesses to his game. And whilst he isn't necessarily proving that week in, week out, you can argue his case for his consistency. But when you're playing for a team like Everton, yes, you're the main man, but you're going to be playing against teams significantly better than you one every 3 matches. So you're not necessarily going to get a run of, okay, goal here, 2 goals here, goal here. You're not going to guarantee that from a player playing at a slightly smaller club than you guys like Aguero and Costa and Kane.
I suppose so, but I mean, so you think Aguero is the only player who's better than him, like the only striker?
I think arguments could be made for Kane, Ibrahimovic, and Costa, but I'll argue the case against Ibrahimovic, where Ibrahimovic I certainly wouldn't trust in terms of getting behind of a defence.
I mean,
he's not the quickest.
I think the difference there is Ibrahimovic maybe doesn't need to. Which I think...
That's fair.
Do you not think... I mean, if we're talking as a rounded player, I suppose physically... You know, Lukaku, all Lukaku's got that's as good as Ibrahimovic or better would be his pace, surely.
I mean, perhaps. My argument would be, though, that you could put Lukaku in any team in the Premier League and I would think he'd do well. If you had Ibrahimovic in a team like... in a team, say, like... Crystal Palace, for example, right?
Yeah.
A lot of their attacks come on the counter attack. I mean, I know that they're not scoring a lot at the moment anyway, but a lot of their attacks come from counter attacks. And whilst they have a guy like Benteke who is good in the air, much like Ibrahimovic, he won't necessarily have the pace and the sort of stamina to keep going backwards and forwards at the high intensity that he would have to if he's not constantly harassing the centre-backs in their own half.
I don't know if that's completely fair, especially considering I think United's main threat is on the counter-attack, and he's doing pretty well there. I don't know. I think Ibrahimovic, I think, has proved himself kind of time and again, but he's settled in everywhere he's been, really.
That's true.
So I think to say that, I mean, I know this isn't what you were saying, but almost to say he wouldn't like cut it at Crystal Palace is a bit of an odd kind of thought. I think. I mean, he's the oldest player ever to score this many goals in the Premier League. It's his first season in the Premier League as well.
Sure.
I mean, age permitting, I think there's not a shadow of a doubt we'd be saying Ibrahimovic is a better player.
Maybe Lukaku's just the kind of player I feel would be more useful to more teams.
I suppose that's not unfair. He definitely cost a lot less in wages.
Sure, that too.
But no, I think I can understand kind of your perspective. I just don't think that he's that good yet. But I mean, he is, he's still only 23. He's still got time to get better and better, which is quite a scary thought.
Sure.
Where do you think he could end up if he leaves Everton? What kind of clubs are we talking about?
I mean, there have been links with him recently with, I think, both Chelsea and United.
Yeah.
Which I suppose are easy links to make, because, Lukaku has said that he would be, more than willing to work with Mourinho again. And, when you're Chelsea and you're top of the table, it's kind of easy to say, okay, well, there's a striker who's doing really well. We'd quite like him. It's just logical. It makes sense.
Yep.
But looking at teams maybe outside the Premier League, I don't think PSG would be the most unrealistic kind of a team to maybe try and go in for him.
No, especially if something happens with Cavani.
Sure. And maybe Juventus as well, with Dybala being linked elsewhere.
Yeah, that would make sense. They've been linked with him in the past.
Sure.
What about someone like Real Madrid, for example? Think he's the kind of player they'd be looking for?
I'm not sure. I think Real Madrid over the years have had a tendency to go for the big star names, and there are bigger names in terms of strikers out there right now than Lukaku, who I think Madrid will be looking at. Dybala maybe being one. I don't think it would necessarily fit in with their usual method of signing players. But that doesn't mean to say that I don't think he'd be a good buy if he did.
I mean, you say that. You look at the last kind of two, I suppose three really, major signings in terms of, being a striker. Benzema was kind of making a name for himself. He wasn't a massive signing.
Mm.
Higuain was a virtual unknown when they signed him. Morata, obviously, they signed back. Am I missing anyone?
Maybe not. But then you have to think, okay, their best player right now is, I'm not going to say getting on a bit as if he's like on the decline. Like, he's still definitely one of the best players in the world, but you'd probably be looking at a player who can maybe instantly replace the goals that he may not be able to offer in a few years' time.
Yeah, they'll have a bit of difficulty finding that.
Yeah. But I don't think they're going to be looking at, a currently mid-table Premier League club for their striker when they could look at teams like PSG and Juventus and Chelsea and whatnot.
I suppose that's not unfair.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think he'd be a good signing for someone like Real Madrid, PSG, Juventus. I think he'd be a good signing for all of them. He'd cost a lot, but yeah. I think he's got that ability. I think he can play at the highest level without a doubt.
I agree.
Yeah. Another match that was fairly interesting at the weekend. Sunderland demolishing Crystal Palace.
Indeed. 4-0.
Yeah, at Selhurst Park as well.
Sure. Further cementing my reason for thinking that they will probably stay up.
Yeah, I mean, Sam Allardyce, playing against his former team, wouldn't have enjoyed that one at all.
No, not at all. Jermaine Defoe bagging 2 goals in extra time in the first half. Not to mention the 2 goals prior, but
he's another one who's kind of, at the where you think he'd be coming to the end of his career and still bagging in the goals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think Crystal Palace are in big trouble, especially if they turn in performances like that.
Sure. I don't think that they necessarily have what it takes to get out of that rut either.
You look at the quality of their players and you think, you know what, they've actually got some really good players there. They've got, Zaha, Benteke, Scott Dan's a good defender, Mandanda's a good goalie, Cabaye.
You mentioned Cabaye, though. He was arguably Crystal Palace's worst performer in the game against Sunderland.
Oh yeah, definitely. But it's these are kind of quality players that they have in terms of their ability. It's just they don't seem to have the fight in them or the spirit to get out of it. Their performances like the one against Sunderland are what got Pardew sacked to begin with.
Sure.
So yeah, they're in big trouble. There doesn't seem to be any kind of grit in that team. Which is for Sam Allardyce team.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think for a team being managed under Sam Allardyce, that's almost unheard of.
Yeah. So that's. Yeah, I think they're in big trouble.
Sure.
I have a question for you.
Right.
Do you know which players, and I'll give you the amount, there's 5 of them, have scored 5 goals in a single Premier League match, following in from the fact that Lukaku scored 4 against Bournemouth?
Right. Off the top of my head, no. I'm just trying to remember of really, really high-scoring games to begin with. I can remember one without a shadow of a doubt. I remember Berbatov.
Yep, that's one of them.
Berbatov did it for Manchester United. Other than that,
I'll help you out a little bit. There was one last season.
Right. I mean, nobody did it for Newcastle in the last game of the season.
It's interesting that you mentioned Newcastle.
Aguero?
Yep, Aguero scored 5 against Newcastle last season.
Oh, brilliant.
Yep. Just because this is probably a bit of a harder question.
Sure.
I'm going to give you a little bit. We've actually discussed one of the players who scored 5 in the last few minutes. We've talked about them.
Defoe?
Defoe has scored 5 in a game, yep.
Right.
Then there's a couple of English players from the 90s who did it as well.
English players. I've got to assume Shearer then, surely.
Yep, Shearer did it. One more.
One more. English players from the 90s. Cole? Andy Cole, that be?
Andy Cole is the other one.
Ah, nice.
Yeah. Have you got a question for me?
I do. Just going back to something that was also talked about earlier on in this podcast. What were the original name for the New York Red Bulls?
I don't think I'd get this. In fact, I'm certain I won't get this. It might ring a bell when you tell me, but nope, I don't know.
They were the New York / New Jersey Metro Stars.
I did know that. That's really annoying. No, next time I'm not helping you with your question.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. I wouldn't have known what to give you for that.
You could have just said, train astrology.
Train astrology. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Hope you've enjoyed our podcast this week. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, follow on Twitter, like on Facebook. If you want to subscribe on iTunes, you can do that too. SoundCloud follow as well. Lots of places to find us. But yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.